History, Housing, and Schools, highlighting the history of housing segregation in Baltimore, Maryland, and its impact on the events of April 27, 2015, and beyond. A focal point in segregationist efforts in Baltimore occurred in 1910 when a Yale University-educated lawyer named Ashby Hawkins purchased a home in the Mount Royal section of Baltimore, causing an uproar among whites. The result was a petitioning in Baltimore into black blocks and white blocks. This was described by the New York Times as the most pronounced Jim Crow measure on record at the time. It's worth noting that in Roland Park, a section of Baltimore City, there was an early planned suburb, and it was developed especially for white occupants during the progressive era between 1890 and 1920. It demonstrated how a belief in segregation in real estate was promoted, and the concept involved the exclusion of African Americans and Jews from housing there because of the potential or the conclusion that they would be bad for property values. In 1917, the U.S. Supreme Court found ordinances like Baltimore's 1910 segregation rule unconstitutional. The reason was because such ordinances restricted the property rights of white homeowners to sell their homes to whomever they wished. In a counter-response, the mayor of Baltimore instructed Baltimore City building inspectors and health department officials to cite anyone who rented or who sold properties to blacks in predominantly white neighborhoods, and they were to be cited for code violations. In 1925, 18 Baltimore neighborhood associations formed, quote-unquote, the Allied Civic and Protective Association, and this was designed to urge new and existing property owners to sign, quote-unquote, restrictive covenants that committed them to never sell their properties to blacks, Negroes, African Americans. Covenants in Baltimore were enforced by the city-sponsored Committee on Segregation. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was created by Congress, and it reflected the U.S. racist tradition of rigid white-black separation, and it openly supported racist covenants, largely excluding blacks, even middle-class and wealthy blacks, from the homeowners boom that was occurring between the 1930s and the 1960s. Typically, blacks were denied mortgages wherever they lived. Restrictive policy meant that the U.S. federal government endorsed a system of, quote-unquote, financial apartheid. This resulted in allowed whites who were seeking the American dream to have access to credit systems that were backed by the U.S. government, while blacks were subjected to unscrupulous lenders and had to pay high-priced financial predators under a contract system that had rigid installment plans, vulnerability to repossessions, poor repair histories, and decaying property values. This system of financial apartheid accelerated urban decline and growth, and encouraged the growth of ghettos. It prevented generations of blacks from gaining wealth typically generated from home ownership. A reference is given to writings by Richard Ronstein that noted, even as some municipalities and states began to pass laws prohibiting racial discrimination in housing, beginning in the late 1940s, enforcement mechanisms were weak, and no effort was made to reverse the pattern of racial separation that rapidly expanded across America and impacted its landscape. The distressed conditions of African American working and lower middle class families in Maryland's largest city and elsewhere is almost entirely attributable to federal policy that prohibited black families from accumulating housing equity during the 1930s through the mid-1960s, thus preventing them from bequeathing that wealth to their children and grandchildren as white suburbanites have done. That's a quote from Mr. Rothstein. Ready. Black contract buyers, which is an interesting phenomenon, were unable to get mortgages, were restricted to overcrowded neighborhoods, had to rent apartments at higher rents than those for similar dwellings in white neighborhoods. An alternative offered was the contract sales process, which meant monthly payments were not amortized. A single missed payment meant loss of a home, and no accumulation of equity occurred. According to Burl Sattler, the author of Rutgers University's Family Properties, because black contract buyers knew how easily they could lose their homes, they struggled to make their inflated monthly payments. Husbands and wives both worked double shifts. They neglected basic maintenance. They subdivided their apartments, crammed in extra tenants, and when possible, charged their tenants hefty rents. Contract buying was commonplace in Baltimore. It was solely due to the federal government's policy of denying mortgages to African Americans in either black or white neighborhoods, as referenced by the Washington Post article May 3rd, 2015. The United States federal government led the development of policies contributing to segregation. There were 20th century federal, state, and local policies that were explicitly designed to separate the races, whose effects endure today. In any meaningful sense, neighborhoods and, in consequence, schools have remained segregated. Baltimore's segregated and economically depressed neighborhoods reflected that by the mid-1930s, 89% of the black population was confined to an area surrounding the downtown Central District of Baltimore. Housing Authority of Baltimore basically had divided housing programs into two groups: one black housing program, one white housing program. Federal public housing policy developed during the New Deal from 1932 to 1939 respected the existing neighborhood compositions, therefore placed projects for low-income blacks in black ghettos, placed projects for middle-income whites in white neighborhoods, and adopted regulations that established the practice of redlining, excluding people of color from government-subsidized mortgages. After World War II, Baltimore City continued segregationist programs and introduced public housing in high-rises. The only vacant site of 39 considered outside the chosen area for additional housing, an area in Cherry Hill near the city of Baltimore, was an isolated peninsula, and it was adjacent to a city landfill and an incinerator. 3 high-density black high-rises were built by the Housing Authority. They were Lafayette Court, Lexington Terrace, and Murphy Homes. These projects created large, dense clusters of poverty and segregation. Other acknowledged factors and actions that supported and sustained segregated housing include bank regulators from the Federal Reserve and other agencies approving redlining policies that allowed banks and savings institutions to refuse loans to families in predominantly black or changing neighborhoods, and to black families attempting to purchase homes in white suburbs. Mayors and public officials organized homeowners associations and encouraged them to enact racial deed restrictions. The IRS extended tax exemptions to churches where organizations were frequently based, and to associations as well. Between 1950 and 1964, Baltimore began an aggressive urban renewal program that displaced more than 25,000 people. Notably, 85% of these people were black. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration financed movement of working and lower middle class white families, including those in public housing, out of cities. They denied mortgage insurances to blacks. They prohibited the developers from selling homes to blacks, and they required developers to write deed insurance restrictions that prohibited resale of homes to quote-unquote incompatible racial elements. The Federal Housing Act of 1968, Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, outlawed refusal to sell or rent a dwelling to any person because of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in the sale or rental of a dwelling. An update. June 25, 2015, the Supreme Court decision in a 5-4 ruling upholds the right to pursue housing discrimination claims and preserves the elements of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Baltimore's black population was subjected to a century of federal, state, local policies that restricted them to isolated slums. Current federal housing policies disproportionately direct low-income black families to segregated neighborhoods and away from middle-class suburbs. It's worth noting currently that many long-established ghettos are geographically isolated from mostly white suburbs, and that voluntary choice, charter schools, magnet schools, and changes in attendance zones may influence low-income black children's enrollment in predominantly middle-class schools. Comparatively speaking, it's worth noting that according to data comparing Baltimore City with 2 surrounding counties in the area, Baltimore County and Anne Arundel County, the black population in Baltimore City is almost 3 times that of those 2 counties, and the high school diploma rates, the college graduation rates, unemployment rates, and poverty rates all reflect the disparity between the surrounding counties and Baltimore City, with the preponderance of deficit numbers and needs existing in Baltimore City, and fewer of those being reflected in the data that's identified for Anne Arundel and Baltimore County. A 1994 suit by civil rights groups against HUD regarding segregated public housing in Baltimore was eventually settled with a proposed remedy that vouchers would be one vehicle for remedying the situation. But only a small number of families actually participate in that program, and has not dismantled Baltimore's black ghettos. Hence, the problem continues. A concluding thought expressed well by the New York Times on May 9th, 2015, notes that the acute nature of segregation in Baltimore and the tools that were developed to enforce it over such a long period of time have left indelible marks and have given the city a singular place in the country's racial history.